Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our panel today on privilege. This is a multifaceted issue filled with complexity, and it manifests itself in different ways. In education, in jobs, access to capital, often access to basic human rights and respect. And it's not a topic which lends itself to easy conversations, but we've been avoiding the uncomfortable conversations for a very long time, and that has contributed to the vast inequity which has unfolded, as evidenced last week by the Fed's report that showed 50 of the richest Americans have the same wealth as the bottom 165 million people. The world skews itself towards the advantaged, and because it is so inculcated into society, those on the receiving end often don't ever think of their lives as having any privilege. Race, gender, and social class are obvious examples, but there are subtle ones as well, like how the US skews towards Christianity. And as an example of that, the stock market is closed on Good Friday and Christmas. So if you work on Wall Street as I did, those are just paid holidays for you. But if you wanted to take off for celebrating Yom Kippur or Eid, you might have to use a personal day to do so. So before we begin the session, I'd like to ask each of you watching, just for the next hour, as a start, to make yourselves uncomfortable. Take an inventory of what you think your privileges have been, and in ways that the world might have skewed towards you. Not to discount any of the hard work and struggles that you might have been through, but just take a moment and try and figure out what that privilege has given you. I was born white and male in the United States. And since the people with those same two traits essentially made all of the rules in America, I have benefited in ways I never had to think about. I want us to walk away from today's session with practical, tactical ideas on how to work towards a level playing field for all. Because once you start seeing privilege, it's very hard to unsee it. So with that, I want to introduce our esteemed panel. We have Sarah Kate Ellis, who is the president and CEO of GLAAD. We have Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation. Daniel Markovitz, who's a professor of law at Yale Law School and the author of The Meritocracy Trap. And Felicia Wong, who is the president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute. Welcome to all of you. So Darren, I want to start with you. Let me start with you, Darren, for some table setting. One, how do you define privilege? And give me an example of where you think you have it and where you don't.
Is defined as the sort of backpack of accessories that those of us who are successful benefit from, our children benefit from. That may be color, it may be our financial advantage. And I'll speak personally as an African American who grew up in the American South in a racist community where white supremacy and closeness to whiteness brought you privilege. As a light-skinned Black man, I was privileged over darker-skinned Black men in social and other contexts. Growing up in the South, the reality of growing up in the South is a reality of one where that whiteness is privilege, and the closer you are to whiteness, the more privileged you are. And we have seen this in the American South going back to our very origins. The slave owners often had children, as Thomas Jefferson did with Sally Hemings. And as we know now from the oral history of the Hemings children, they were treated with more privilege than the dark-skinned slave children. In fact, Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson's children never worked in the fields. They worked in the house. The slaves who worked in the house were often lighter skinned because the reality was they were the children of the slave masters and they had privilege. So that's just one example in which I have seen privilege in my own life.
Wanting to go to Felicia. Yesterday, we actually had a panel And we spoke about that if you can unlock $1 trillion of economic impact by inclusion of Black and Brown communities around the country. The title of this panel was about giving up privilege, but how do you think about it? Is it a zero-sum game? If I'm giving up something, is someone else taking it away, or can we grow the whole pie?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking, because I think even in the phrasing of the question that animates this panel, are you willing to give up your privilege? That phrasing actually implies a kind of zero-sum game, which I think is fundamentally wrong. The pie can actually get a lot bigger if those of us with privilege are willing to give up some of that. Now, I know that's pretty tough, and we can talk about why. And I think it's particularly difficult to give up privilege individually. It's hard if I'm the only person giving up privilege, if I'm the only person paying more taxes, not really the benefit of higher taxes, I'm just paying more taxes. And yet I'm still not going to see better schools, better bridges, better roads as a result of it. So it is in many ways a set of collective actions. But I think it's very important to remember that this actually can be a positive sum game and not a zero-sum one. And just to put it another way, which was made very clear by the pandemic, it's kind of corny, but it's true, we really are all in it together. The pandemic makes very clear, COVID makes very clear, we're only healthy when we are all healthy. And I think that's a very important thing to remember as we think about access, privilege, and more collective forms of wealth.
Daniel, so back to your work on economic inequality. When I think of a place like India, which has an embedded caste system, and we can think about what that has wrought historically. But then here in the United States, there's this myth that there's some sort of meritocracy, and based upon your own work, your success is at your own achievement. So give us your sense of what you think about that and where you think the flaws in that are.
Well, so I think I want to say two things about that. The first is that there's a fundamental myth of openness in our society, both in the educational institutions that lead to advancement and in the labor market institutions that allow people to earn large incomes based on their educations. So that, for example, a typical elite private school in the US spends about $75,000 per student per year educating its kids, whereas a typical public school may spend only $15,000 a year. And this produces an Ivy League with more students from the top 1% of the distribution than from the entire bottom half. So that being born to substantial advantage is almost a necessary condition for getting fancy educations, and fancy educations are almost a necessary condition for getting top jobs. So that's one way in which we have an extremely skewed social and economic order. Then on the other hand, in the labor market, we have a way of setting people's wages which allows people with certain training to capture enormous incomes, but doesn't track people's contribution to the public good or the general interest. So, for example, the best studies suggest that if you're a garbage worker or a care worker or a teacher, you capture maybe 10 cents of income for every dollar of social product that you produce. Whereas if you're a banker or a lawyer, your private income is bigger than your social product. So our labor market is dramatically skewed to allow certain people, not coincidentally the people who have the fancy educations that only people from rich families can reliably get, to get enormous private incomes way in excess of their social product, and other people whose social product is very large to capture only a small share of that for themselves. So again, the labor market compounds the skew that the educational system introduces.
Okay, great. Thank you for that explanation. Sarah Kate, I see that you're back. So we were talking about representation and the importance and how that translates into privilege.
Yes, thank you. Apologies for that. Representation, as I was saying, is storytelling, and stories are told by those people who have access to telling those stories. So both in front of the camera and behind the camera, if you look at the makeup of who's writing the stories, who's directing the stories, who's funding the stories, that has a big impact on what stories are actually being told. Specifically, though, for the LGBTQ community, we're talking about a community that has largely been left out of storytelling until the past decade, honestly. But prior to that, we were invisible from storytelling, or better yet, stereotyped and troped in storytelling. And because as a community, we were largely invisible from culture and society, media shaped what people thought of us, how they felt about us, how they looked at us in terms of privilege. And we were super down at the bottom of the privilege at that game. And so but what I have seen is as I think privilege at a level different than what a lot of people are saying here has been somewhat democratized by media, by everybody having their own platform, most people having their own platform. We've been able to tell more stories, and we have been able to, and help the LGBTQ community have more than one view on itself. And when you look at the past decade of policy moving forward for the first time for the LGBTQ community, whether that be marriage equality or employment rights, that has happened largely because we have been telling our stories, because we have been known now as a population, as a group within America who had largely been left out of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. But now, when you mentioned two recent advances on marriage equality and employment rights, and I think people have asked me, well, don't I feel great that progress has been made? And I think, no, I'm not particularly grateful that I can't be fired because I show up to a work event with my partner. So how do you think that translates into how privilege is so embedded in society that this notion of when you gain the same access and rights as other people have, that you should be grateful?
Thank you for asking that, because I do a lot of interviews about when these conversations, what happened. So if you think about this over the past 3 years, in front of the Supreme Court, the right to whether or not I could be fired from my job just for simply being gay was discussed. The right as to whether my wife and I could be served a cake was debated and discussed and decided on. So our rights, there's another, whether or not we can adopt is up for debate on November 4th, the day after Election Day, at the Supreme Court. And what I keep saying to people, and it's not landing because of this privilege and this lack of understanding or knowledge, I should say, and not in any part to anybody's fault, but when you're discussing whether or not I should exist in a society and have the same rights as anybody else, there is a big default here in terms of privilege and dignity. That is, it's less about the right for me. I mean, the right is very important, but it's really about the fact that how can you continue to discuss our dignity and us as a community in front of the Supreme Court? And so I think they're very intricately intertwined, our rights and privilege, and that we should be grateful that everybody was, a lot of the interviews that I had after the employment law in June passed in front of the Supreme Court, in which they said that you could not discriminate against LGBTQ people at work, so we could not be fired for our job. People thought we should be taking to the streets and celebrating. And I said, isn't that just a basic right? And what does that say about our society that we're even discussing that?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Darren, I want to pivot back to you, and I want to talk about the various roles that players play. So governments, corporations, we're increasingly seeing corporations step in to issues that they feel government has been lax on. So an example, a couple of years ago, Mike Corbett at Citi being an entity that issues over 100 million credit cards, put in certain restrictions about gun purchases using their credit cards. Starbucks just recently announced they were going to actually hold their senior management accountable for hitting diversity metrics. How do you see the role of philanthropy in this system? And what do you think you have as levers that maybe corporations and governments don't?
Well, I see our role in philanthropy, certainly at a place like the Ford Foundation, as a social justice philanthropy. And if we are a social justice philanthropy, we should be asking some fundamental questions about the structures and systems, practices that compound the privilege of some and compound the disadvantage of others. And what I mean to say is, we have in our society a systemic challenge of discrimination and exclusion. And in order to address and resolve these issues, we need to take a systematic approach. And that will require us, I think, as a sector, philanthropy, investing in the systems and disrupting the systems. So what do I mean by that? I mean the systems of capitalism. So philanthropy is a product of capitalism. And therefore, we should be asking questions, as Dr. King suggested philanthropy do when he said in 1968 that philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. So I believe that we in philanthropy have to ask questions of capitalism. Why are we producing so much inequality? Why are more workers of color and women workers more likely to be discriminated against, more likely to be at the bottom of the wage and labor market? So that's what I'm interested in our doing, and that's the work that we're doing at Ford.
And how do you, controlling such a large foundation, right? How do you think about the power dynamic? Because you are a foundation, but individual philanthropists, many who may come from that top 50, there's scant representation of anybody of color in that community. How do you catalyze movement of capital gained, as you just say, from the beneficiaries of this system, which is disproportionately unfair to others, to move that money towards doing something productive? I mean, Ford can set a great example, but how do you catalyze others to follow what you're doing?
I think we have to catalyze by setting examples, and we have to catalyze by being engaged in the system of capitalism. So we are involved with a number of large pension funds and asset management firms asking questions about of our investees. How are you addressing issues of race, of sexual orientation and identity, of climate change and the environment in your practice as a company, as an enterprise? I think the real challenge here that often goes unspoken is and makes people most uncomfortable. Rich, when you get back to what makes us uncomfortable, what makes Americans uncomfortable is talking about race, because that is the intersectional issue that manifests inequality in our country. And so, yes, as a queer Black man, I understand intersectionality, but I also know that the reality of representation of queerness in America is a white person, is not a Black queer man. Because one of the reasons people, as Sarah was saying, have just taken for granted that this progress has been made is because they have white privilege. And they can actually believe that progress has been made and they're not going back. That is not a privilege that African Americans have ever taken for granted, because we know that because of race and the history of race in this country, we are always vulnerable to recede, that progress is never guaranteed to African Americans. And so that's the question that I ask philanthropists. Why is it that you are so unwilling to engage in the root cause of so much of the injustice, so much of the inequality in our society?
Great. I want to stay on intersectionality for a minute here. And go to Felicia. I know that you often write and speak about the confluence of social, moral, and economic rights. So kind of that intersection. So talk to us about that. How dependent is one on the other, and how do we kind of set this right?
Those things are extraordinarily dependent on one another. And, I think we got into this false conversation, especially after the 2016 election. We ask ourselves this weird set of questions. Is it race or is it class? And I think, as Darren said, you absolutely cannot disaggregate those things. Or is it gender? You can't disaggregate any of those things. It's extraordinarily notable that Black Americans and white Americans of the same education level, white Americans have greater health outcomes, greater income outcomes, greater wealth outcomes, greater criminal justice outcomes. This is no accident. So you must absolutely look at class, but you have to look at class and race as intertwined. And many people, including Isabel Wolfelston and Darren, have recently been talking about this as a kind of caste system. So we need to work on all of these things together and not think that just by having a set of class-focused answers that we're really going to be able to solve problems that are also problems that are about social and racial stratification.
Mm-hmm. So Daniel, as we think about this stratification, right? So I think your work has revealed vastly different, even SAT scores between families that have some affluence versus those that don't, which then translates into race and other things. Give us a snapshot of what that looks like today, particularly that you come from a very elite college, and what could be a potential answer?
So the snapshot is that the degree of hierarchy is almost unimaginably extreme. The gap between the resources of the richest universities, but also the richest schools and all other universities and schools has never been greater. And the various forms of privilege, class privilege, race privilege, that those who are inside these elite institutions have is as great as it's ever been. What to do about it? I think it's really important to understand that there's a model that most of these institutions are pursuing right now, and that it's the wrong model. So the model that most of these institutions are pursuing right now is the model of equality of opportunity. And the idea is that they are looking for people with less privilege, whom they then will try to admit into their elite institutions at the top of the hierarchy, and hope in this way to diversify the top of the hierarchy and make the hierarchy itself okay. And while it's obviously true that if you have a hierarchy, it's better if the hierarchy is diverse than if it's not, it's also the case that the hierarchy is so extreme that inequality in outcomes makes meaningful equality of opportunity impossible. And that even if there were more equality of opportunity, it would not justify the vast inequality of outcomes. So that the better model is one of massive democratization of the elite. That requires making elite institutions less elite. It requires making rich universities and schools relatively poorer. It requires them to serve many, many more students. It requires them to have less demanding admissions criteria. It requires in corporations making executives less powerful and devolving power to line workers. It requires making whites less powerful and devolving power to people of color. So it requires in 1,000 ways eliminating structural advantage, eliminating hierarchy, promoting equality, rather than thinking that one can keep hierarchy in place and just make it okay by letting some people who've been traditionally excluded into the top.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that brings up an interesting point. I want to go back to you, Darren, for a second. The technology desert and divide, which results in privilege to access, that we're being shown in blazing colors here with the pandemic and how children are accessing education. You wrote a line in a recent essay that stuck with me. You said, kids are clicking into classrooms from the parking lots of fast food restaurants. And it's not 10 or 20 kids, it's millions of children are accessing their education now through the pandemic. How can you inform policy discussions using this moment that we have today to make a change in that environment on education?
Well, one of the things that both Daniel and Felicia have shown through their work is how inequality, when it takes hold in a society, how it corrupts the institutions and systems in that society such that they become rigged. So let's talk about the technology challenge. The technology challenge is that we have, in a pandemic, 12 million children who do not have connection, primarily because they do not have access to broadband. So broadband, which comes through, for the most part, internet service providers, is a open marketplace that is basically, while they might disagree, the ISPs may disagree, are basically unregulated, when in fact they are public utilities, or they should be public utilities. But they, because they have a grip on our political system, the ISPs have been able to basically rig the system so that they are able to charge rates that are simply unaffordable. And the government has not been able to respond, in part because of the work of ISPs, in containing the government, in fully responding to the needs of poor people and low income people. So we have this system where the intersection of democracy and capitalism is in stark relief. And what we are seeing more and more, we saw it in the hearings with the Zuckerberg and the other tech CEOs, is that when democracy and capitalism collide, capitalism wins. And the problem in our society is that we are a democratic capitalist system, and democracy must come first. And if we cannot, because of inequality and the ways in which our systems are increasingly responding to the rich and the corporate rich, we are going to be at risk of losing the very thing we cherish most: freedom, opportunity, and what it means to be an American.
And I think much of that opportunity comes from access. And Sarah Kate, I know that you speak about this a lot, how access translates into privilege, and how most Americans would think that every child is accessing their educational system the same way. And of course, that's just not true today. So tell us about access from your lens.
Absolutely. I think there's 2 points here. One is that, access, when you ask people at the beginning of this panel to think about their privilege, to have the tough conversations with themselves and to be uncomfortable a little bit, that's where this actually can turn into action. Because the people who are listening to this conversation and are partaking in the Milken Institute have a tremendous amount of privilege. With that privilege comes access, whether it be to platforms, whether it be to boardrooms, it be to a whole host of opportunities. So a very simple step that you can do is do an assessment of what you have access to. For me, I have a tremendous amount of access to platforms because of the seat that I sit in, because of the organization that I'm fortunate enough to run. I use that access to raise up voices of people who don't get to be heard from within our community. That includes women of color, trans women, or people of color. And one of the things that I've done, back to what Darren was saying about representation and it largely being white gay men in the LGBTQ community, one of the things that I've done with our study annually is now challenge us to have people of color at parity with white representation. And we have now exceeded that for broadcast television in terms of LGBTQ representation. So you can use your access to what you do and what you have every day to help and bring along other communities that might not have the same access. And that's also turning over platforms. We've been seeing a lot of that. When we talk about social media social media is also a breeding ground of hate and misinformation. And that's why we are teaming up with the ADL and Color of Change to do our first ever safety index on social media. So we're going to be measuring social media like we have measured Hollywood and television shows and streaming content and movies. We're now going to be measuring social media platforms based on safety for our community, because people without privilege are targets, and we get attacked on social media, and we get dragged on social media in really negative, terrible ways. And you can even see today, just as a little plug, I'm wearing purple because it's Spirit Day, which is anti-bullying day for LGBTQ youth, because we know that 70% of our youth who do have access and do get online are actually bullied, are cyber bullied for being LGBTQ. So that is another issue that we face when we talk about this connected world. But to harken back to access, I think it's so important for all of us to do an assessment of what we have access to and how we can use those platforms and that opportunity to up-level other voices and to level the playing field.
Okay, great. I think, when people see inequity or something that's unjust as good people or that's holding themselves as American values, we tend to revolt against it in a one-on-one basis. But then once it gets part of a system, it's sometimes harder to see and know what to do. So Felicia, I want to go to you. I think statistically, the workplace of most people tends to be much more diverse than their community at home, where they live, where they go to church, where they recreate. And therefore, people, because they're in employers that have diversity policies and it seems front of mind for people, maybe don't think it's so much of an issue when they go back to their homes and everyone looks like them. What policy do you think that have been enacted in the past contribute to this that we need to revisit? And what do you think we can recommend going forward as something proactive to address some of this?
Yeah, I want to go back to something that I think Daniel said and that Darren also hinted at. They talked about the ways in which private companies, private universities can become exceedingly narrow in who they serve. The truth is we can do this quite differently. We can talk about public options. We can talk about public options for broadband. We can talk about public options for banking. We can talk about public options for universities. And this isn't just some fantasy idea from the progressive left. These are actually things that we have done in American society in the past that have made huge differences in real people's lives. My parents are Chinese immigrants. My dad was born in Georgia, and he grew up in the Jim Crow South. He was so poor when he was born. He was born literally in a shack. His first bed was a salmon crate. But he moved to California when he was about 15. And this was at a time when California had really powerful public universities. The UC system, the CSU system, which is the California state system, and a range of very strong, very well-financed community colleges. My dad ended up going to UC Berkeley, mostly because it was the school down the street. But he went to UC Berkeley for $80 a semester. That is because the state of California then made a commitment to public education for all kids, all people in California. It made a huge difference in my father's life, but also in the building of a strong economy in the state of California. So I think it is a mistake to think that public financing, public options for many of these public goods is somehow, again, back to that theme, that's not a zero-sum game. It's not that public financing is going to take away from our collective good. Instead, there are real concrete stories that show that public universities, public services can really strengthen both our economy and our democracy.
Mm-hmm. So let's stay on education for a moment. Daniel, I want to go to you. We often read about 8, 9-figure gifts sometimes to private universities. Maybe some of the people listening to this call have made those. should those entities be tax-free?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And let me just jump off from where Felicia was. Look, the tax exemption of these elite institutions amounts to an enormous public subsidy for them. And to give you a sense for the size of the subsidy just in education, somebody recently calculated that Princeton University's tax exemption amounts to a public subsidy of $100,000 per Princeton student per year. Compare that to public subsidies of $12,500 per student per year at the State University of New Jersey at Rutgers, and of about $2,500 per student per year at Essex County Community College, which is up the road from Princeton. So Princeton gets a public subsidy of 40 times as much as the local community college, even though today there are more students at Princeton from families in the richest 1% of the income distribution than from the entire bottom half. So what we have is we have a public subsidy for a rich person's club, and there's no conceivable justification for that. And the extent of the wealth of these institutions is becoming so great, it's assuming macroeconomic proportions. Back of the envelope calculation is that if you take the 10 richest university endowments in America and grow them out over the future at the rate at which they've grown in the past, and you take US household income and wealth and grow it at the rate that it's grown in the past, sometime in the 22nd century, those 10 universities will own all of America. That's the extent of the skew, and there's no conceivable justification for it again. And so to go back to Felicia's point, public subsidy for educational institutions that serve the broad public, not for institutions that serve a narrow elite.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the obstacles which restrict people from seeing or addressing their privilege. So Darren, I want to go to you because I think I'm looking at it from a corporate lens again. Microsoft and Wells Fargo recently came out and pledged to double the amount of Black leaders inside those organizations. They then get a letter from the US Department of Labor asking how that possibly complies with non-consideration of race in employment. And at the same time, you have an executive order now restricting diversity training for federal contractors. As these obstacles get thrown up, how do we knock them down?
Well, I think, first of all, the issue of litigation risk associated with the objectives that Microsoft and other companies, Wells Fargo and others, have put in place is simply that. It's litigation risk. Companies take on litigation risk all the time. And so I'm not prepared to say they should throw in the towel because they're told that they may be sued. If they're serious about it, they should be willing to go to court to prevail. I think the larger issue here is that the thing that privilege buys you is insularity from getting uncomfortable or changing your behavior. The whole idea of privilege is that it buys you, it gives you the currency to not have to deal. And even, as a Black gay man, I'm in conversations often when I go into a room or I'm on a panel and they say, we're all going to have to get uncomfortable if we're going to be serious today about making progress. If you are Black, every day you are uncomfortable. Every day you live without the privilege. And even if you may have economic advantage, you still know that that does not necessarily translate in all contexts into privilege. And so I just think that for me, when we talk about whether it's Wells Fargo making a commitment, yes, Wells Fargo should make a commitment because Wells Fargo, along with other financial institutions, stripped billions of dollars of wealth from Black and brown households because of predatory practices. And many other corporations in this country have engaged in predatory practices vis-a-vis communities of color and vis-a-vis rural, working class, white communities who have also been disadvantaged, certainly when you look at broadband access and ISPs. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we get a level of honesty about just how dire the situation is in this country before we reach a point of no return? And I fear that if our politics and our culture aren't able to resolve these things, that is exactly what's going to happen.
Okay. Just a reminder that if anyone would like to submit a question, please do, and we'll save a few minutes towards the end. We'll do that through the platform.
Do you mind if
Sarah,
I jump
same
in
question.
on this one? Oh.
No, please go ahead.
I work
just
with
gonna
a
follow
lot of, thank you. Just to continue with what Darren is saying, I work with at any point a couple of dozen Fortune 500 companies, CEOs, and I think there is an absolute real reckoning happening. I think that there is a consciousness that hasn't been brought to light before, and I think that I believe we are going to see change, and I think it's going to be slow. We know change is slow, but I feel that we're seeing people step up for the first time in pretty remarkable ways. Now, I think that what has to happen though, and this is something that I talk about quite often, is that there are multiple approaches to this. And first and foremost, you do have to look internally, and you have to clean up your house, and you have to get your insides the right way. That means, everything from your board has to look like what America looks like. Your executive team needs to look like America looks and sound like America, has diversity of thought, not only diversity of people, but diversity of thought. And then furthermore, I think that you need to then move out into the market and use your platforms for social good, which is what we were talking about earlier. But when I'm at the World Economic Forum, or I'm all over the world talking to these CEOs, and I feel like for the first time, there's serious conversations happening, and they're not going to get it right the first time or every time. But I think that what we need to do is help guide them to do the right thing. And I think coming out on these issues for the first time in a lot of these situations is a good sign. It's not going to be perfect, and there's a long, long way to go. And we've been working at this for decades and centuries, quite honestly. But I think that they also realize that it's less about their shareholders and much more about the stakeholders. And that shift I've seen happen over the years. And, you're talking about, we have employee activists right now. So even if they're not doing it for the morally right reasons, they know that they are going to be called on the carpet. We live in a cancel culture society and a call out society. And that in large part has to do with the democratization of media and social media. And that gives people and consumers more of a voice than they've ever happened to have before. Before, you used to write a letter and mail it, and maybe in 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, you'd get a reply back. Now you take to social media, you get troops rallied around what the injustice has been, and all of a sudden there is a real challenge in front of these corporations. So I think that the environment has changed dramatically, and I think that there is a great opportunity for change here, especially with corporate America.
I think you bring up a great point, like the speed of information flow today. Daniel, just quickly to you, why do you think that the college admissions scandal touched such a nerve, and the speed with which it went viral and the response? Did people really think that these systems were not unfair?
I worry about the nerve that it touched, because the scandal you're talking about is one in which rich parents bribed admissions officers or coaches to get their kids into college. Remember, the only reason why that was illegal is that the colleges didn't capture the proceeds of their own corruption. If the parents had been slightly richer and simply paid the colleges money to get their kids in, that would have been legal and ordinary practice. Or if the parents had simply paid teachers and tutors and schools to help their kids do well on tests and grades, that would have been what we call meritocratic admissions. And of course, those two other things, the bribing the colleges and the buying education for your kids that other people can't afford, are much more powerful drivers of structural inequality than the rare case in which some soccer coach is given some money under the table. And so the outrage at it was natural because we live in a caste system and people see the injustice, and it was an injustice. But the outrage also served an ideological function of masking and, in fact, validating a series of practices like buying expensive education for your kids and the subsidies that private schools get, like alumni preferences, like giving donations to elite institutions to get your kids in, which are much more damaging to our society than the thing the outrage was directed at.
Right. Felicia, I want to go to you. So back to what Sarah said is that corporations and structures need to look like America looks. So in California, or where I'm sitting, there are 35% of public companies that are based here that have no ethnically or racially diverse or LGBTQ representation. A law was just recently passed that starting next year, they would have to have at least one, which echoes the one woman law, which was already passed. Are those policies helpful, good to have, maybe need change? What do you think about that?
I think those policies are one step in an important direction around corporate governance. I'm glad you brought it up because I think corporate governance is one of the places where CEOs and other private sector executives can really make a huge difference. It won't surprise you that I'm going to say that it would be better if we had more laws, both at the state and the federal level, around corporate governance. But I think in addition, there are things that CEOs can do right now to improve access and to lessen unfair privilege across the board. So you can imagine that companies can put worker-focused committees, worker-focused subcommittees on their corporate boards right now. Companies can broaden the mandate of their compensation committees to include not just executive compensation, but also all comp and all HR for all employees. Companies can consider becoming benefit corporations. Delaware just made it easier for companies to become benefit corporations, which means that legally companies have a duty, not just to shareholders, but to all stakeholders. Delaware just made it easier because they made it a simple majority vote such that companies can become benefit corporations. But there are many, many things that we can do right now, even short of federal law, that would make corporate governance both better for workers in the company and better for the economy overall.
Great, thank you. So we do have a couple of questions. Let me just read them and then we'll see who wants to take it. Is it possible to be both privileged and underprivileged at the same time? If so, what are your responsibilities to those who benefit from privilege more than you and those who benefit from privilege less than you? Who wants to take that? Why don't we go to Darren?
I think Sarah said it very well in recognizing the question of privilege and who has it, because it is about, for me, how do I use my privilege? How do I use my power? To what end and on behalf of whom? And I think that's one of the really important questions that each of us has to ask, because privileged people and the systems and practices propel compounding our own privilege, whether that be in the economy, in where we live, and where our children go to school. All of the things Daniel so articulately laid out, it almost pushes us. We've just got tailwinds behind us. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, who am I using this privilege for? And how are my networks being activated? For what ends? And so for me, it's a real self reflection. I am able to remain grounded because I am proximate to my own family. And in my own family, I deal with that reality because I see how the grip of racism took hold even in my own family. I was born in a small racist community in rural Louisiana, but my mother took me away from that community. And I, like Felicia said, in Texas, I got to attend great public schools. I proudly tell anyone who will listen that I have never attended a day of private education in my life. And that was because we believed in investing in public goods. I also know that the racism that my cousins who remained in that small town in Louisiana faced was a different kind of racism than what I faced. And therefore, our lives, our trajectories took us to different places. So I ask myself, how is it that my cousin, who is as bright as I am, and I am certain, had he been in an environment where his human capital would have been invested in, he would not have ended up in Angola prison, and I am sitting on Park Avenue. I think there is something fundamentally wrong in a society where racism has such a hold on the question of opportunity and mobility and where you live, your zip code, what you were born into is such a determining factor in your life outcomes.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question. Just how do you make sure these conversations are being put into action versus just being reverberated in an echo chamber? Often we're preaching to the choir. And my guess is that in the whole spectrum of content that we're even putting out over our global conference, people who are tuning into this right now are already the converted, people who are interested in this topic already and think about it. So Sarah, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I feel that they probably are the converted. So thank you for joining us. But I think they're looking for ways to bring others along because oftentimes I don't think there are many companies, there are many situations, there are many organizations where everybody's in the group think on these topics. And I think a lot of awakening has to happen, a lot of education has to happen. So I do believe that people who are like-minded do come to these to get tools, to get ideas, to get new ways of framing the conversation, to opening up the conversation. And so that's why I always like to give opportunities for solutions and to open other people's minds around this. So I think also it's something that I do too, is I go into rooms that might be uncomfortable, that see me maybe as a little bit more liberal than they are, a little bit more left than they are, or I consider myself personally or moderate, but I feel like you have to, if you want to get your message to different audiences, you have to go to different places. And especially in this world and this landscape, which really serves you in your own echo chamber. So it's very important to go to different places, but also have the tools to go in there. You don't want to get caught flat-footed in there.
Okay. So we are almost out of time, and I think I do want to go through one lightning round at the end. And one of my favorite quotes is from Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, who said, "You can't wring your hands and roll up your sleeves at the same time." So I think given the audience here, and to Sarah's point, they want tools to go out and be armed with something that can change people's minds, or at least bring up this conversation. What do you think? Each of you take 1 minute and give a word of advice to the people on the line. We'll start with Daniel.
Politics and structure. Good motives are great and can make you an honorable person, but to make real change, you need to band together with others in expressly political coalitions that aim at reforms that have the property that when you get the small reform, your coalition becomes more powerful. You also have to work on changing the institutions and the mechanisms of power in society so that good outcomes become less reliant on good motives and instead are built into the structure of economic and social life.
Great. Felicia?
Yeah, we're at a moment right now, with potentially huge political, social, economic, and cultural change. That's not only because we are 20-something days before the most important election of our lives, but it's also because we are in the midst of this huge change in ideas, what we think is possible in the world. Sarah referenced it, Daniel referenced it, we've all referenced it. And I will just say that some of the ideas on the table right now about investing $2 trillion over the next 4 years to have green jobs and climate jobs, an idea like that is potentially a game changer, both with respect to policy, but also with respect, as Daniel said, to the kinds of political coalitions that we can build in favor of more change. So now's the time.
Okay, great. Sarah Kate?
Thank you. I will go the exact opposite, which is small changes can have a big impact. So I think we have the global and macro look here, but if we take a micro look at this and you think about what one key takeaway that you learned today and that you can bring forward, if you can talk to other people in your social world, in your business world about privilege and what that looks like and how it affects the work that you do, and you start using that to educate people, whether it be on the playground, your children's playground, or it be in the boardroom. That is how we make change. As a social justice warrior, small steps make big impact. And so don't overwhelm yourself. Do something though. Do one thing a day that educates somebody about their privilege and talk to them about how to use their access, their available platforms for change.
Great. Okay, we'll close out with Darren.
Thank you. This has been such an honor. Part of this, I would say, as a philanthropist, think about investing in not just charity, not just generosity, but how do you invest in justice and dignity? Think about what dignity and justice looks like in philanthropy. And what that looks like is not charity. Yes, we need to fund homeless centers. We need to fund human services, but we need to also fund the organizations that are getting at the fundamental root causes. We need to fund the institutions of our democracy. We need to fund those working to invest in voting, in access to the ballot, in access to justice. So while we will, during this pandemic, need a lot of investment in human services, in poverty alleviation, we are going to need investment in the organizations fighting for justice on the front lines, fighting in the courts, fighting the powerful to ensure that we save our democracy.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for all of your insights today. I want to thank all the attendees. I want to encourage everyone to stay uncomfortable. I lied at the beginning when I said it was only going to be an hour, because if you don't stay uncomfortable, things aren't going to change. And we often talk in the business world about getting to scale. It starts in small steps. So everyone who's been listening on this call, please, if you talk to these issues with 2 people you know, we've already tripled the number of people who heard it. And engage in that dialogue. It's the only way that change is going to happen. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.